I'd like to turn to the issue of defence, which of course, like our energy security, I think is much more important than the PM's Voice to Parliament proposal. Now, a new report, this was in the Australian newspaper today, has found that the Australian Defence Force is so bloated with, quote, star-ranked commanders, its combat effectiveness is at risk of being undermined. Joining me now to get the latest on this is Senior Analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Malcolm Davis. Malcolm, talking to lots of veterans over the years, this probably comes as no surprise to me. What about to you?
Yes, look, it's no surprise to me. There is an incredibly excessive amount of senior commanders, senior level officers that are occupying positions within the military. Obviously, you need to have commanders in the field, you need to have commanders in headquarters and in defence and so forth, but they should be kept to a minimum because ultimately what matters is the combat capabilities of the ADF rather than administrative roles. And I think that there needs to be a review just to see whether all of these flag-ranked officers, or star-ranked officers if you're talking Army and Air Force, are essentially really necessary.
Do we know, Malcolm, if the defence review that the Albanese government did pretty quickly after taking office, that was basically it was set up to look at things like, you know, whether AUKUS was going to be the right thing for us to do or not. Does that go to this issue of there being a top-heavy defence force?
It goes to workforce. In other words, having enough people in uniform and also in the civilian defence community to be able to ensure that we do have credible combat capabilities. And it addresses the fact that there is a serious deficiency in terms of fighting soldiers, pilots, naval officers, seamen, and so forth. So there is a real workforce problem which could seriously undermine our ability to operate some of the kit that we're looking at acquiring in coming years. That needs to be addressed fairly urgently.
Who judges the people at the top? Who for example, says that the Chief of the Defence Force is doing a good job or not such a good job? Does that come down to Minister Miles and to the government? Do they make that judgment?
Look, I think by the time you get to that level in your military career, you are experienced enough to do a good job. I don't think anyone's doubting that these people are doing a good job. The question is, do we need them all? Do we need so many senior officers in these high-level ranks? And I think that's where the focus needs to be, is maybe we can reduce the number of senior-level positions and essentially reallocate personnel, workforce, and also resources such as money to be able to increase the combat capabilities. But really, when we get down to it, the only thing that's going to seriously increase the combat capabilities of the ADF is if we start buying weapons quickly. We cannot afford to be waiting 10 years to get advanced long-range strike weapons or essentially new vessels at sea. We are moving way too slowly at the moment for responding to the threats that are out there.
When you look at our raw numbers, whether it be Air Force, Navy, Army, and even Army Reserve, do we have enough, numbers there? Have we recruited well enough to keep what should be a fighting force that if we did come under some sort of aggressive attack, that we could defend ourselves properly?
Well, remember that future warfare is not like war battles of the past where it was sort of massed soldiers fighting each other. If you look at what the US has just announced in the last few days, they've announced a program called Replicator, where they're going to mass produce thousands of autonomous systems over the next 18 to 24 months to match what the Chinese are doing. Now, that timeline is very significant because clearly they realize that time is not on their side, and they realize that mass is important. But what they're not doing is investing in huge numbers of people. What they're investing in is technology and combat power. And I think that's what the Australian Defence Force needs to do. They need to invest in these strike systems, autonomous systems, defensive capabilities, rather than trying to recreate the battles of the past.
Just on the Americans, we read today that they are going to give some grants and loans to Taiwan so they can boost their defensive capability. That's not going to make the Chinese very happy, Malcolm, is it?
Well, to be honest, both the United States and Australia shape its defence policy not to please the Chinese. We shape it to protect our own interests. And that interest has to be supporting Taiwan, giving it the sorts of capabilities it needs to be able to deter Chinese aggression. And if that deterrence fails, then to be able to defend. That $80 million transfer from the US is not a huge amount. There needs to be a lot more sent to Taiwan. And I think the key point I would make here is that Taiwan is not like Ukraine in the sense that in Ukraine we can ship weapons into the Ukrainians across the land border and keep them supplied. In Taiwan, if the Chinese do invade, which they are quite possibly ready to do in the second half of this decade, it's an island. We can't get weapons to the Taiwanese to support them. So we need to arm them before the Chinese do use force, and we need to arm them in such a way that we can deter China from taking that fateful step. And if that deterrence fails, then we can defend effectively.